The storm that began on that yacht was never going to end with one scandal, one apology, or one fractured glance across a devastated room. In Genoa City, humiliation never stayed private for long, and betrayal never remained confined to the two people who caused it. It spread like poison through families, marriages, rivalries, and old wounds that had never truly healed. What happened to Jack did not simply leave behind a stain on his name. It ripped open the most fragile fault lines in the Abbott family, handed Victor a fresh weapon, and awakened something dangerous in Patty, whose instability had always made her the kind of threat no one could predict until the damage was already done. As the truth remained tangled in manipulation, sedation, revenge, and emotional ruin, every person involved found themselves standing on the edge of a deeper collapse. The real danger was no longer the scandal itself, but what people would become while trying to survive it. Jack returned from the yacht with a mind clouded by shame, confusion, and flashes of memory that refused to settle into a single coherent truth. He knew enough to understand that something had gone terribly wrong, but not enough to defend himself in any way that sounded convincing. That uncertainty became its own prison. For a man who had spent years trying to rebuild dignity after heartbreak, rivalry, and family war, the idea that he could be reduced once again to a spectacle of weakness was unbearable. Worse than the humiliation was Diane's face, the silent devastation in her eyes when everything shattered in front of her. Jack understood that no explanation would erase that image. Even if he had been manipulated, even if he had been drugged, even if Patty had once again inserted herself into his life like a force of destruction disguised as obsession, the damage was already done. In Diane's pain, he saw not just disappointment, but the terrifying possibility that she no longer recognized the man she had fought so hard to believe in. Diane, meanwhile, was drowning beneath a far more complicated kind of agony. Her first instinct was fury, because rage was easier to hold than sorrow. Rage gave structure to heartbreak. It allowed her to blame Jack, blame Patty, blame every reckless male weakness that had once again turned her life into a battleground. Yet beneath that anger was something even harder to face: fear. She had built this chapter of her life around the belief that she and Jack had finally earned stability after years of chaos, judgment, and second chances. To watch that marriage suddenly become vulnerable, not because of some outside rumor, but because of something she had seen with her own eyes, was almost too much to bear. She wanted to believe there had been manipulation involved, but believing that would also mean accepting that Patty had once again found a way to infect their lives. That thought unsettled Diane more deeply than she admitted, because Patty was not simply a rival or a nuisance. Patty represented the kind of madness that refused to obey logic, the kind of enemy who did not need a rational motive to destroy a home. Kyle felt that destruction in a more immediate, more combustible way. He did not have the patience to sit with ambiguity, and he did not have the emotional distance required to sort guilt from victimhood. All he saw was Diane unraveling. All he saw was the woman who had fought to reclaim her place in her family now looking wounded, humiliated, and emotionally unsafe again. That was enough to ignite his protective instinct into outright hostility. Part of him wanted to condemn Jack for recklessness, because doing so simplified the emotional landscape. It gave Diane a clear villain and offered Kyle a clear purpose. Yet another part of him knew something about the story did not fit. Jack's behavior was too reckless, too sudden, too conveniently destructive. That contradiction only made Kyle angrier, because uncertainty felt like weakness, and weakness was the last thing he could afford while his mother was breaking. So he hardened. He shifted from son to defender, from family mediator to emotional bodyguard. In his mind, protecting Diane no longer meant comforting her. It meant identifying threats and removing them. If Jack had become one of those threats, then Kyle was prepared to turn on his own father with a coldness that would have once seemed unthinkable. Victor watched this emotional fallout, the way a general studies a battlefield after the first wave of impact. He had no interest in mercy, and certainly no interest in letting Jack recover. For Victor, Jack's disgrace was not merely satisfying, it was useful. The Abbotts had wounded him too many times, challenged him too many times, and survived too many battles with their pride intact. Victor never forgot a humiliation, and he never wasted an opening. What had happened on that yacht presented him with a rare opportunity to strike not at Jack's business interests first, but at the very foundation of his personal life. A broken marriage made a man vulnerable. A divided family made him reckless. A scandal tied to Patty made everything more volatile. Victor understood that once emotions reached a certain temperature, people stopped thinking strategically and began reacting from pain, ego, and panic. That was exactly where he wanted Jack. So Victor's secret strategy began to take shape, not as one blunt act of revenge, but as a layered attack designed to ensure that Jack never regained control of the narrative. He did not need to tell Patty exactly what to do. He only needed to convince her that she still mattered, that she was still seen, still valued, still capable of altering Jack's destiny. Victor knew that someone like Patty could be steered not through discipline but through emotional bait. A little validation, a little encouragement, a little suggestion that Jack and Diane's bond was weaker than it looked, and Patty would do the rest. The danger in using her was obvious. Patty was unpredictable, unstable, and impossible to fully contain. But Victor had never feared collateral damage if the outcome served him. He was willing to gamble with fire if it meant watching Jack burn first. Nikki sensed the danger before she understood its full shape. Her conversation with Kane left her unsettled, not simply because of the business implications involving Lily and Victor, but because she could feel Victor's energy shifting into one of those darker, colder modes she had learned to recognize over the years. He became most dangerous when he was patient. Most people feared his explosions. Nikki feared his calm. That calm meant he had already chosen a direction and was simply waiting for others to walk into the trap. Her instincts told her that Patty's return was no accident, no random resurfacing of a troubled woman from Jack's past. Victor was repositioning pieces, and whatever game he was building would not stop with embarrassment. Nikki knew too well what happened when Victor decided to teach someone a lesson. His vengeance was never clean. It spread through spouses, children, reputations, and old vulnerabilities. That was why her concern for Jack deepened into something more urgent. She may not have been able to stop Victor entirely, but she could at least try to interrupt the momentum before it crushed another family. Kane, forced to absorb the truth about Lily's partnership with Victor, found himself pulled into his own private storm of bruised pride and dawning suspicion. He did not want to accept that he had underestimated how far Victor's influence extended, or how deeply those around him were willing to entangle themselves in Newman calculations. What disturbed him most was not merely the alliance itself, but the realization that everyone in Genoa City seemed to be adapting to Victor's games in one way or another while pretending they still had choices. Kane hated being made to feel naive. That feeling sharpened his resentment and made him more open to acting from anger rather than judgment. The more he considered the layers of secrecy unfolding around him, the more he began to see a city full of masks, where loyalty was temporary and every alliance concealed a private survival instinct. In that atmosphere, Victor thrived. Patty's looming return cast a dread over everything because she was not entering a stable environment but a city already primed for emotional violence. Her fixation on Jack had always carried a twisted logic of its own. In her fractured mind, love and destruction existed side by side, and that made her especially dangerous now that Jack's marriage was weakened. If she sensed even the smallest opening, she would not hesitate to exploit it. Diane understood that before anyone said it aloud. The possibility that Patty might come back, believing she still had some claim on Jack, filled Diane with a disgust so intense it nearly eclipsed her grief. She began to shift from wounded wife to strategic survivor. If Jack could not protect their marriage from chaos, then she would have to do it herself. That instinct pushed her toward harder, more ruthless thinking. She started questioning whether compassion had made her vulnerable, whether forgiveness had merely invited new humiliation, whether surviving in Genoa City required becoming colder than the people trying to destroy her. Jack, already suffocating under shame, found himself cornered from all sides. Diane's trust was fractured. Kyle's judgment was merciless. Victor's hand seemed to be moving just out of sight. Nikki's concern, while genuine, only confirmed how serious the situation had become. And hovering over all of it was Patty, not just as a person but as a symbol of the parts of Jack's life that he could never fully outrun. He was a man trying to hold on to dignity while being dragged backward into chaos. And the harder he fought to explain himself, the weaker he seemed. That humiliation began to change him. His anger, once restrained by guilt, slowly sharpened into resolve. If Victor was behind this, Jack knew passivity would only invite more destruction. If Patty was being used as a weapon, then someone had to sever that connection before she detonated the rest of his life. But every option carried a cost. Fight back too aggressively, and he risked looking guilty or unstable. Stay silent, and he allowed others to shape his downfall for him. Kyle's protectiveness soon curdled into something harsher when he realized Diane was beginning to retreat emotionally into herself. Her silence frightened him more than her tears. Silence meant she was recalculating. Silence meant she was deciding what she could live with. Kyle could not bear the idea that Jack's mistake, or Jack's manipulation, might once again leave Diane isolated and blamed. So he became more confrontational, more willing to challenge family unity for the sake of shielding her. That choice deepened the Abbott fracture. What had once been a family crisis now became a family war of interpretation. Was Jack a victim, a fool, or a man whose hidden weaknesses had finally destroyed the illusion everyone wanted to believe? Kyle's refusal to soften forced everyone around him to choose emotional sides, and once that happened, reconciliation grew even more distant. Victor, sensing the Abbott instability growing worse, had every reason to push further. A divided family was easier to outmaneuver than a united one, and he had no moral hesitation about pressing where it hurt most. He understood that the true brilliance of psychological warfare was making people believe they were acting on their own impulses, when in fact they were merely reacting to pressure someone else had applied. If Kyle alienated Jack, if Diane lost faith, if Patty resurfaced at just the wrong moment, Victor would barely need to move another piece. The family would finish destroying itself. Yet the most explosive danger came from one truth no one could fully control. Patty was not a machine, not a hired operative, not a disciplined conspirator. She was a volatile human fault line. If she sensed manipulation, she could turn. If she interpreted rejection as betrayal, she could lash out. If she decided Victor was using her, she might redirect her rage in ways that shattered every careful plan. That was what made this entire scheme so perilous. Victor believed he was orchestrating destruction, but he was also gambling with a force that could destroy the wrong target at the wrong time. Nikki saw that clearly enough to fear not only for Jack and Diane, but for Victor's household as well. Once Patty entered the game, there was no guarantee anyone would remain safe, including the man arrogant enough to think he could control her. And that was the terrible beauty of the storm now gathering over Genoa City. No one was innocent, but some were more wounded than guilty. No one felt secure, but each believed they still had something left to defend. Jack wanted his marriage. Diane wanted her dignity. Kyle wanted to shield his mother from further devastation. Nikki wanted to stop Victor from becoming monstrous again, and Victor wanted the kind of victory that only counts when someone else is broken beyond repair. Every motive collided with another. Every act of love carried traces of pride, fear, control, or revenge. The result was a city trembling on the edge of emotional catastrophe, where one unstable woman's return and one ruthless man's secret agenda could turn private betrayal into total family collapse. Jack and Diane were not simply facing obstacles. They were being dragged into a carefully deepened pit of suspicion, humiliation, and psychological warfare. And in a world where pain so often became strategy, the next move was never about healing. It was about who would strike first, who would lose control first, and who would still be standing after the truth had done its worst.